Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, How to Decolonize and Decisnormatize Curricula with Sage Publishing and Georgia State University's Diverse Faculty Alliance. My name is Olivia Butts, and I'm a Senior Corporate Communications Associate at Sage. And to get started, I'm just going to pass it over to GSU's Curtis Bird, Special Advisor to the Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for further introductions. Take it away, Curtis.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm so glad to be a part of this. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Curtis Bird. I'm the special advisor, as Olivia said, to the provost on DEI at Georgia State University. And we're happy to partner with Sage Publication for this well-timed webinar. We are connected through Sage Publishing, based on my co-authored book with Dr. Rahana Mason coming out in May 2021 from Lever Press, titled Academic Pipeline Programs, Diversifying Pathways from the Bachelor's to the Professoriate. And that can be found at Academic Pipeline Programs, all one word, .com, academicpipelineprograms.com. I know that's a shameless plug, but had to say it. As an institution, Georgia State has achieved extraordinary success in using a data-driven approach to tackle challenges for faculty and students. Further, one of the most diverse campuses in the country, we need to look at innovative means to confront these challenges for our diverse students and faculty. Within this spirit of innovation, Georgia State's Commission on the Next Generation of Faculty was tasked to identify challenges and opportunities to address faculty diversity, equity, and inclusion. Based on the Commission's report, an implementation steering committee was formed to put the Commission's transformative recommendations into action. One of these recommendations was to enhance faculty retention with faculty affinity groups. Last year, the ISC members and myself developed 6 affinity groups and a governing board called the Diverse Faculty Alliance, the DFA. This group has provided ideas for this series, and in particular, the PRISM group. PRISM is our LGBTQ plus group from the DFA, came specifically up with the idea of this particular webinar. So with that being said, I would like to introduce the chair of that affinity group, Dr. David Pauly. Dr. David?
Thanks, Curtis. Let me add my welcome to everyone else's. Georgia State is well represented here today, both by people attending, by Curtis, myself, by at least one esteemed colleague, Marnie Brown, on the panel today. We're really excited to be hosting this. I'm an adjunct faculty professor of management in the Robinson College of Business. As Curtis said, I'm a member of GSU's Diverse Faculty Alliance, and I'm the group leader for PRISM, which is the Alliance of the Sexual and Gender Minority Faculty and Staff. This 1-hour webinar is going to be recorded and archived for future viewing. Sage will be sending out a link to view it to all the registrants in the coming weeks. If any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you as soon as possible. In particular, Olivia, who you met at the beginning, who is mastermind, voice of God, czar, and ringmaster for all of us. We also encourage you to use the Q&A box throughout the event. Before I pass over the mic to Dr. Gavi Ansari, who will be moderating today's event, I wanted to share with you a bit about GSU's Faculty Alliance groups, as Curtis referred to. So the DFA advocates for faculty, community, professional development, and various activities for underrepresented minorities and other marginalized groups on the faculty and in the staff within each respective group. Our member organizations are the faculty of the African Diaspora Association, or FADA, the Women's Identity Faculty Identity Group, LACHI, which is the faculty group for Latinx, Chicano, Caribbean, Hispanic, and Indigenous faculty. The Asian American Faculty Identity Group, also known as AFIG. PRISM, which stands for Pride, Inclusion, Respect, Support, and Movement. And GSU VETS, which is Georgia State University's Veteran Employees Team Support. If you want to learn about what we're doing and how we're doing it and how well we're doing it, I encourage you to check us out online. You can find information about all of our faculty initiatives at dei.gsu.edu. And with that plug, nowhere near as shameless as Curtis's, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Ansari. Gavi, take it away.
Okay, thank you everyone, everyone who's been involved, and also Olivia, who's under Sage Publishing, and you can't really see Olivia's face, but Olivia, Michael, Curtis, and Dave have really been instrumental, as well as Rihanna has been one of the people making this happen. So instead of introducing people by speaking about them, there's an idea of people speaking about themselves, so we'll have that. I'd like to introduce you though to a slightly different format than you might be used to for the way that we run this event. And I'll be explaining that so that in case it's unfamiliar to you, you'll be able to join in. So at the moment, I'm hoping that my slide is visible, and I will just check with the other panelists. Yes, it's visible. Okay. So in Australia, which is actually hundreds of different countries that were colonized to be called Australia, we always start with an acknowledgement of country if we're trying to be decolonizing and respectful. And this is more than just a tokenistic gesture. This is really our way of acknowledging in this country what's happened. So whether it's on someone's own country, acknowledging what's happened, that usually is done. Welcome to country. But it's not the land of the person running the meeting or the land of the person speaking or the institution, then we will acknowledge country, because you can't welcome someone to a country that is not your country. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country and their enduring sovereignty over their land, waters, wisdom, and community. I bear witness to their diversity and the resilience over genocide, honoring elders, past, present, and emerging. And the term elders, by the way, it's sort of like having a doctorate. Elder doesn't mean an older person you hold in high esteem. An elder is actually a formally conferred title. So elders, past, present, and emerging, including any Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous people, and elders who might be here today. This is morning my time, afternoon, I think in your time zone for most of you. The land on which I live, love, and work belongs to the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. And like all of Australia, it is stolen land for which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's sovereignty was never ceded. This is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land.
Hey, Gavi, just quickly, would you be able to make them full screen? We have a chat comment about not being able to see them.
Yeah. How do I make this full screen? I'm just not sure.
If you go into view, you should be able to press presenter mode under.
Okay. Can people see it now, or do you see two different slides?
Oh.
Because I think what happens now is.
Yeah, if you just exit out of the chat on the right from the webinar, that might help.
Okay, I've exited out of the chat. Can people now see it? I'm going to stop screen share and I'm going to restart screen share. Typically what happens is that if I share the whole screen, it shows you more stuff than you need to see. Is that visible now? Okay, thank you. This is a different platform than I'm used to. So Olivia has a poll And Olivia, I wonder if you could set up the poll just to check in with people about whether or not you know the land that you're on. Okay, so folks can see that. It looks like most people here do know what land they're on, which is great. It looks like maybe a bit under half the people have learned some words and phrases in that language. Slightly over half have learned traditions from that culture. So just notice that we might know the land we're on, but what level of knowledge and fluency do we have in understanding what that means and what that culture is about, what that society was about. And when we think about colonization, that's part of the impact. I've seen a couple comments about the poll. A few people have had difficulty, but hopefully that got resolved. Maybe perhaps Olivia could assist people with that. So thinking about that, we're thinking about all the countries that people are on, that people are coming from here today. And what is the acknowledgement of country? Part of why we don't know, many of us don't know, even people who are from the country that they're on often have not been able to access a decolonized education. So that there might be limited opportunities to learn even your own language, to learn what happened to your people. And so I think this is something to acknowledge, that part of why we do the acknowledgement is to recognize that there's an ongoing impact of genocide, of massacres. I know this is the case in the North American context as well. There were there's genocide and there were massacres. That there's been a theft here on so-called Australia of 60,000 plus years of land that just got stolen. And a lot of the mining companies will then, destroy land, and the people who are supposed to protect it don't protect it. There's ongoing dehumanization. There's the stolen generations here in Australia. I know there's an equivalent where there were schools that people got taken away to, mission schools that people got taken off reservation, what would be reservation land. And of course, having a reservation is only necessary if someone's taken your land in the first place, that you need to designate special areas, because otherwise the land would just be your land. The intergenerational trauma impact and the economic and resource deprivation. And photos only used with permission. This is a close friend of mine, Crystal Love, who's a sister girl from the Tiwi Islands. And the idea that people, in particular people who don't fit into a colonial white Anglo idea of what so-called traditional gender is, are just completely erased. So Aboriginal sister girls are completely erased, partly because of ongoing colonization and systemic racism. Same with brother boys. There was a traditional role, and it wasn't the same as the role of women. It doesn't quite translate into trans women either. It's a very unique role to be a sister girl. And I find there's people in the government here who are running statistics on demographics. 5 to 10% of the Tiwi Islands population is sister girls, according to Sister Girls' own count. And yet there are people who say in conversation, and I was talking to someone who runs national policy, and this person said, "Excuse me, what's a sister girl?" I was thinking, hold on, you have the Aboriginal portfolio. What's wrong? Why do you not know this? So, and acknowledging, for example, that there are societies that have 5 traditional genders. So when people talk about traditional genders or the gender binary, they're really speaking in a culturally bounded way, because that binary doesn't universally exist. And people who've been racialized and minoritized don't necessarily have that recognition, that inclusion. And in Australia here, we also have Samo and Fa'afafine as well, who get erased. So for the person who asked about the agenda in the Q&A, yes, there is an agenda slide. But in terms of how we enter this conversation, I've spoken with the other panelists, and we think it's very important that we focus on how we interact. And part of that is based on cultural humility rather than this idea of competence, that we don't need to be in an expert stance. So the concept of cultural humility is about recognizing that there's a lifelong commitment to learning and critical self-reflection. There's no point where you can say, my box, I'm done, you know, I don't have anything left to learn, I don't have anything left to critique in myself. What we're trying to do is to redress power imbalances. There's no neutral position. So if you take a neutral position, you're really just complicit with whatever oppression's going on in the status quo. And so we want to redress those power imbalances. We also want to have institutional accountability. So it's not enough to just recognize and talk about, which I think gets done a lot, but we need to actually say, okay, well then what does that mean for how we hold institutions accountable for what happens? And how do we build mutual respectful partnerships based on trust? The kinds of things we're thinking about, and I'd encourage folks listening to think about, is how do we move systems that we're part of at an institutional level toward a greater equity and inclusion, not just buzzwords, which we hear a lot of, but what does that mean in practice? And that's what we'll be talking about. And how do we acknowledge that that is always based on our own positionality and privilege, that is who we are and which unearned advantages we may have gotten? And how do we identify and work to disrupt inequities in systems? So there's a concept of cultural safety that we talk about a lot here, which might be useful to the North American context. I don't hear cultural safety being spoken about as much, whereas in Australia, people having these conversations are always invoking this concept of cultural safety. And the idea is you can be a really good person, but empathy and good intentions are not enough. If I think about anti-racism scholar Ibram X. Kendi, you know, Dr. Kendi often says this statement about, you know, there's no such thing as being a non-racist. You can be racist or you can, and if you're not actively trying to challenge the ideologies that are embedded into the institutions around you and into the interpersonal dynamics around you, then there's no way for you to transcend that. And so being colorblind actually helps to maintain implicit racism by making those things unable to be talked about. So part of cultural safety is a challenge to that. Cultural safety means knowing and respecting cultural protocols. And just the fact that some people will say, well, what is a cultural protocol? What does that even mean? Yeah, if those of us who are from cultures that have cultural protocols, we know what that means. In fact, there are cultural protocols, but the cultural protocols that most people are familiar with in a white-dominated sort of colonized space, those are going to be what some people refer to as the nice white meeting norms. These assumptions about how do you run a meeting, how do people talk, and that goes back to agenda, which is why I've shared this before I'm going over how we do the agenda. This is about personal knowledge and sharing info about yourself when it can create equity and trust. So it's about actually saying, I have a position here and I have privileges. And whoever we are, we have a position, and that might be a position of marginality, of being colonized, of being oppressed. And there will also be various kinds of privileges. Looking at partnership and collaborative practice and mutual learning and check-ins. This idea that we don't have a right to comfort, we have a right to respect and safety, which is different. And so the idea, the sort of right-wing language I hear often coming out of the US nowadays, where people are talking about some so-called cancel culture, that's a right-wing way of silencing people who are marginalized and challenging the way that they've experienced oppression. And so rather than that, we're looking at an accountability culture where we hold each other accountable out of respect for each other and a positive purpose toward people's goals. So in thinking about privilege, because this word gets thrown around a lot, Privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. This is the I don't know what I don't know aspect. This is why we need to be talking to people who have different lived experiences from our own, because we don't know what we don't know. And a lack of intentionality doesn't excuse us. If I drive past a red light and I hit people in a car, I'm responsible for the damage, even if, oops, I didn't notice. I'm responsible for that level of noticing, because it's understood that if I'm in a moving steel projectile, I have a responsibility to mitigate the risk that is involved in that process. And so in our social interactions, we also have that same duty of responsibility and accountability. That's not about canceling. And I think that is dangerous language to use against people who are having conversations like the one we're trying to have. So just because I have sighted privilege, to describe the image for those of you who might be visually impaired, there is a person on the left who is dressed in stereotypically masculine clothing and who looks probably middle-aged, and is navigating a racetrack that is fairly clear. There's one or two hurdles, but mostly it's a very smooth, clear track. And the person to the right is navigating a very different track. The person on the left is pale-skinned. The person on the right is browner skinned than the person on the left. And the person on the left is paler than the person on the right. And the person on the right is navigating a very challenging field, has a ball and chain around their ankle, is feminine appearing according to certain stereotypes of femininity, and is navigating razor wire and a crocodile and spears. And the person on the left, the pale masculine appearing person, is turning to the other person and saying, what's the matter? It's the same difference. As in, I think we're navigating the same racetrack. They're not. So privilege is when you don't realize that your track looks very different from someone else's, and it's not solely a matter of merit. So agenda, I said I would go over agenda. And I apologize if my internet cuts out, because I think the US does have a very well-established infrastructure, but I'm not in the US. So we actually have a decolonizing format. So rather than that kind of agenda, the problem with the nice white meeting norms and the nice white meeting agenda, some of you got those links and looked over them, is that it really doesn't allow for people to challenge status quo ideas as much. We've got 5 minutes for this, 5 minutes for that. And if you're not the status quo, if you are trying to decolonize and decisnormatize, then unfortunately it's going to take you longer to do that. Sorry, we've run out of time, you can't do that. So we're going to use a linear spiral, a non-linear spiral. And there's this idea of linear communication privileging certain cultural ways of speaking. In Australia, Aboriginal communities often describe conversations as yarning. And there are a lot of cultures that do yarning, Y-A-R-N-I-N-G. And the idea of the yarning is that you kind of start out where people position themselves, they say what their own lived experience is, what country they're from, and they always would do that. And I think there's this sense of pretending to be neutral by not saying positionality that is quite challenging. And I know in a lot of the feminist scholarship in academia, there's been a lot of wonderful work to try to promote this idea of positioning ourselves. I'm sorry if my internet cut out just there. So this idea of positioning ourselves. And so we're going to go in a spiral. We're going to start from the very basis outward, like this image. There's an image of a seashell, like a spiral. And this is seashells. What do? We stick them to our ear and we can listen. And I think that's what we're hoping to do, is promote a different quality of listening. So positionality, privilege, and lived experience is the first spiral. As we go inward, we'll be saying our names, our pronouns, what land we're on. And then we'll talk about points of entry, what brings us into this conversation. And this could be anything. And then we'll go to the third pass, which is key points we'd like to make or get across. So that is the agenda. The agenda is a spiral rather than a linear one, because if we're going to be decolonizing, we actually need to have a decolonizing structure, not just decolonizing format. So thanks a lot. And I'm sorry if my internet cut out there. So what I would like, thank you. And look, I'm just going to read a couple of the comments also about, someone said, isn't it important not only to acknowledge and learn about those whose lands we reside and work on, but also provide reparations as well? For example, Seattle has a living rent program, or we can find tribal councils in our area and provide support in ways they choose. I think this is the in ways they choose is so important, because there's a lot of times where people want to feel helpful, but other people are saying, yeah, actually back off. So I guess, you know, getting in touch with the people in your area. I agree. I agree that reparations, I know what the other panelists think. I think reparations are essential. I think we don't know what reparations people actually want unless we actually ask them. Because like reparations for any sort of cultural theft or harm, it's not really clear. I'd like to comment on that question. So I think that was a really important point. Nope, I'm seeing other panelists like with a bit of shake head. Okay. Then there's another question before we do to our first spiral, which is, I am familiar with cultural safety, but I've not heard of cultural humility before. Is there a good foundational text on this concept that you would recommend? So in one of my slides, I'd cited the Tobalon and Murray Garcia paper. That's actually the pivotal text on cultural humility. There's also a video, which I will send the link to Olivia after this webinar. There's about a half-an-hour video that's on cultural humility. And it's just a good introduction. One of my students actually introduced me to the video. And the video is basically for people who might struggle to read the paper. The paper's a bit dry. You can watch this video. It's a wonderful educational tool. And look, I've just, you know, since we had Curtis's plug for that amazing book that I'm hoping to read, I will also send a link, because I've just actually been the editor of a special issue in the Psychotherapy and Counselling Journal of Australia on anti-oppressive practice. And there's a whole, you know, a lot of people refer to cultural humility there. I talk about cultural humility in my editorial. So, so Olivia will remind me what I've said in terms of the links to make sure that I actually include them. So those are both really, really important comments. And I think reason people haven't heard of cultural humility is because there's a lot of promotion of cultural competence. It's a much simpler format. When you have cultural competence ideas, oh good, I know, I've checked my box, my diversity and inclusion and whatever buzzword box, and now I'm done. It's not about every second, every interaction, every moment. And actually, I think that is what's required, that I go in with the concepts of unknowing. My context is one of unknowing, of unlearning what I thought I knew, so that I can learn how much I didn't know about someone else's lived experience. And so that I'm really able to understand how to move through that space with respect. That I have humility to say, I will never be an expert about your experience. You know, I specialized in African-centered African studies as part of my undergraduate degree, was in cross-cultural international health. And people will say, oh, so you're an expert on blah. No, I'm not an expert. I'm not from Africa. There are hundreds of countries in Africa, even just in the colonial state of Nigeria, there are 300 languages. How could I possibly be a so-called expert? So I think that's that idea. And Marnie's made an important point as well. There's the importance of feeling through cultural understandings, not just an intellectual lens. So you're also unlearning the unfeeling. You're unlearning the colonizing and frankly misogynistic, sexist idea and racist idea that somehow feelings make you less authoritative, that feelings make you less authentic or less valid, and just embracing those feelings. So that's a really important point from Dr. Brown, from Marnie. Okay, so I'm going to the, oh, and Curtis has also posted a link that we'll share with you later, which is a first step on reparations, because also in the US context, there's reparations for slavery, which, you know, to many of us seems like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you do reparations for grievous harm that you've caused that continues to damage people? But it's apparently politically controversial in the US. So there's another link that Olivia's just posted about that. So all sorts of reparations for harm. There's reparations for intersex people who've been non-consensually normalized, which is still happening. Okay, so, and also this concept of redlining. So if you don't know what redlining is, important to learn about that. Redlining, sundown towns, how suburbs got created. There's a really quick, if you want to find a quick clip on YouTube, there's a clip Adam ruins everything, Adam ruins the suburbs. It's sort of a kind of hip, quick comedy show, but it's not actually funny. He talks about how the entire reason that US suburbs were created was entirely because of racism. And so it really blows people's minds when I've shared that with people from the US context. So now I would like to shut up and I would like to hear from the other panelists. So our first spiral is going to be about what's your positionality? What are the privileges you'd like to acknowledge? And what are things you'd like to share about your lived experience? Can I start with you, Stephanie?
Thank you so much. Even just being here has just been enormously uplifting. My position in privilege is, of course, as a Black lesbian, first and foremost, but also as an attorney, as a full professor, as a former prosecutor, as an Army veteran, as a Navy veteran, as a Navy officer, as a mother of children, as a woman of the world in terms of my lived experiences. And I realize, of course, that wherever the intersectionality is in my experiences depends on what day it is. And I think in how we approach the classroom is intuitive by how we self-examine, and that's how what we've discussed, this sort of self-reflection. But particularly in American institutions of higher education, there is a level of risk. So in terms of positionality, how I started as an instructor with not tenure, and with what I discussed and what curricula I introduced, what readings, what language I used, shifted in terms of how far I got ahead. And a lot of how far I got ahead dealt with, and we'll share this experience hopefully, with how much of my positionality I had to either shrink, such as being a lesbian, or expand to get to where I wanted to be. You know, as you climb the ladder, if I started my career fully as I am now, out and in your face, and this is my position and take it, this is who I am, I may not have made it. So my lived experiences in positionality, and I think for most of us, are ever changing, but I definitely like it on this side. I definitely, and when you get to this side of where my position is up, and it brings more freedom, and it brings actually more authority to decolonize and decisnormalize the classroom. And so those are strategic decisions that I think one has to make in American higher ed, especially post-COVID-19. So I thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Those are really important points. I think that some of those we'll be coming back to. Jenny, I now invite you for your first spiral.
Sure, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here. My name is Jenny Beeman. I use they, them pronouns for myself. I live in Western Massachusetts in the US, which is the historic land of the Nipmuc people who lived in Central and Western Mass, as well as parts of Rhode Island and Connecticut. When Europeans arrived at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts in 1620, there were an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 Nipmuc people, members of the nation who resisted the invasion, were killed, sold into slavery, or went into hiding, so that today there's less than 600 Nipmuc people. A little bit about me. I am white, middle class, middle-aged, hearing impaired, queer, and a non-binary trans person. My initial academic training was in African American studies, because when I got to college, I was challenged on my racism and realized I needed to address that. And the more I learned, the more I realized I had a lot more to learn and to unlearn, and the more I wanted to be involved in doing anti-racist work. My second academic training was in higher education administration, and for the past 20 years have been the director of LGBTQ plus student services offices. For the past 15 years, I've been the director of the Stonewall Center at UMass Amherst. And I think I will end there for the time being.
Thank you, Jenny. And Jenny and I go way back. I met Jenny a long time ago, so I'm thankful that they have brought me in.
I was this high.
I was this high, but I'm still this high. Okay, and now I'd like to invite Dr. Marnie Brown to speak.
Good afternoon, or I guess it's good afternoon where I'm at. I am honored to be here with these wonderful human beings to talk about such an important issue that we are facing in not only higher education, but really around the country and so many of our social institutions. Like I said, I live in Atlanta. My understanding is the Cherokee and Muskogee tribes are indigenous to parts of Atlanta, Georgia, where I currently live, as well as being someone that is from the South. I'm originally from Florida and have been in Atlanta for about 20 years now. There obviously is an unbelievable injustice around racial equality embedded in every aspect of our state, to our street corners, to signage, and obviously even recently, there are some neighborhoods in this state, not until the 70s or 80s, that lifted bans on who could live in the neighborhood. So I'm very cognizant of that around me. I position myself as an intersectional queer feminist striving for anti-racist white. And I put the striving part in because I don't think becoming an anti-racist is ever done. It's a lifelong job to undo the toxicity of white supremacy. So I'm consciously aware of that striving component. I also don't identify as able-bodied. I've been chronically ill for 15 years with an autoimmune disease that has taken a lot of my mobility away. But in light of that, I am married with 2 beautiful children and 6 four-legged animals that live in the house, a real lesbian over here. And I work at a 4-year state college north of where I live in one of the most diverse counties in the state of Georgia. And one of the most wonderful things about this particular school that's really brought my positionality in some ways, not necessarily into conflict, but it's allowed me to really think about what it means to be an anti-racist, out queer intersectional feminist, is that so many of the students I serve and work with are first generation, have not been born in the United States, or their family members have not been, and they are the first in their families to attend public education or public higher education. That puts me at a minority in ways that allow me to see the privilege that has been granted to being identified as white and white-bodied. I do identify as Jewish, but that's not necessarily visible. As we know, many religious practices and organizations aren't always visible to other people's eyes, but being at that particular school has allowed me to open up my positionality and allow it to be flexible. I look forward one day to being where Stephanie is as a full professor. As an associate, I'm still mindful of some of the bureaucratic barriers that are placed around me, but that hasn't stopped me from challenging where I work and where I live to become more anti-racist and to be well positioned to accept a human being regardless of background. And thank you for letting me be here today.
Thank you so much, Marnie. That's very important. And I mean, I think some of the things that have already come up in this past were the idea of invisibility and the idea of changing. And I guess when I talk about my own positionality and privilege, and hopefully my internet doesn't cut out while I'm saying this, but it's very much changing. So when Stephanie said, I'm different depending on the context or depending on what the power hierarchy around me is, I feel that very strongly, because depending on where I go, whether or not I have a tan, how brown or how deathly pale I am, I'm treated differently and my position is different. So I think some of the labels, like a lot of people in the US use this phrase person of color, But I think I have a love-hate relationship with using that term. So I tend to say I'm a hybrid polycultural man. I am a man of faith. I have multiple names in multiple languages, and all of them are my real names. And I grew up in urban and rural China. I grew up on the stolen lands of the Eora Nation on the Australian continent, and I also spent time elsewhere. My work is very much informed by a lived experience of disability, of poverty, of homelessness, of migration, of a history of intergenerational trauma from genocide and forced displacement, being targeted for racist violence. Actually, some of that did happen in North America. And I've also been marginalized due to my gender, my body, my kinship, and my sexuality. I identify as androsexual, meaning someone who is drawn in certain ways romantically and sexually drawn toward men and masculine people, which is, by the way, just to say that people who are non-binary exist, and some of them have been my partners. I'm polyamorous, which I think is a taboo in academia, so I'm putting it out there for all of you who might. I know that there's going to be some of you, so yeah, polyamorous people on the map. Come from an intergenerational refugee background, and I strive toward ongoing cultural humility about the fact that I have literacy privilege. I didn't grow up in academia, but I can talk the talk now, and that divide Stephanie was talking about. You know, I have a freedom. I teach at the University of Warsaw in the Faculty of Psychology, but I get to write my own courses, and I can criticize the government, but they wouldn't want me to do that. But I'm aware that if I was embedded faculty full-time, depending on a salary there, I couldn't do that. If I was in a tenure track, I would have to publish stuff, but I would have to watch my P's and Q's, and I'd have to observe those nice white meeting norms, and I can't do that. That's just not natural to me. So as an independent scholar, I've found the freedom that, Stephanie, you had to work your way through the system for. And I've seen Jenny work their way through the system as well. You know, they've gone through that as well. And I suspect, Mani, may be a similar story for you in terms of, you know, having to play the academic game, whether you like it or not. So I noticed my literacy privilege, my independence from institutions privilege, my verbal privilege as a speaking person, because not everyone speaks through words. And I am allistic, I'm not autistic. And I'm sighted, I'm not blind or visually impaired. I do work with a number of people as a therapist who are, I've worked with some deaf-blind people, and it really makes me quite aware. I am of deaf experience and have chronic disability issues, but some of those are maybe more invisible or allow me to have certain privileges that if my disabilities were less hideable, I would be marginalized more the way that a lot of other people are. I'm a non-Aboriginal person, and I live in an ableist, holistic-centric, classist, colonizing, racist society. So that's sort of my positionality, is that I don't come from a white background and I don't come from a Black background, but I had a background in African studies and got very involved in the Black Power movement. And how I got involved in that was because my life was saved when I was being were targeted for racist violence. My life was saved by people, and there were spiritual allegiances formed there. So that was my intro into anti-racist work, but also because I had lived experience of my own family being targeted. Okay, so second pass.
Gabby, you've accidentally muted yourself.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to start with the second spiral, points of entry. Mani, would you like to start us off on points of entry?
Sure. In thinking about, and I'm assuming, Gavi, you're asking kind of our points of entry today, right? Where we've been and how we're getting here today. I imagine, like many of my colleagues here, I've had a day filled with Zoom fatigue because of relentless Zoom meetings, as well as teaching 3 back-to-back classes this afternoon while having my kids do virtual school in the room right behind me. What that does for me, one, it's a reminder that in my work, students still come first. And I do have to adhere to some of the admin speak as chair of my department, but I do find myself trying very hard to put students' experiences, particularly what are recognized, and I don't like this language, but for non-traditional students that are working full-time and taking care of multi-generational family responsibilities and trying to go to school. Something else that I think is important to kind of recognize in terms of what's kind of brought me here to the space today is also spending a great deal of time talking with students today about family formation. And there are so many different ways to think about the way families are formed. And of course, in light of what you shared, Gabi, we had a lot of conversations about polyamory this week, what it means when lesbians choose sperm to form families, what sort of processes are they engaging in, and then finishing off the conversations today around talking to children of gay and lesbian parents about their experiencing being raised in those homes. So that's in some ways what I'm coming into today's discussion with in my mind, and really thinking about how those conversations, those classes, those relenting Zoom faculty meetings have kind of put me in a position where I'm thinking through my feelings and trying to de-intellectualize myself so I can be as present as possible here and not put the academy first, but this idea that we're all forever learners trying to do better by the people we spend time with.
Thank you. And I'm next going to go to Jenny in terms of your point of entry.
Sure, very briefly, although I've taught over the years a lot of African American studies and queer studies courses, my main point of entry to this conversation these days is through doing educational trainings for faculty about how they can create more inclusive, supportive classrooms for LGBTQ students.
Great, thank you. And Stephanie, what about you, your points of entry?
So my points of entry are around power and authority. So I am a criminal justice professor, and at a sort of smallish state college in Pennsylvania, under 10,000, and many first generation students. But in my field, it is male dominated. It is a strict adherent to a hierarchy of authority, top down, and there is great fear of deviating from what in American society are the symbols of authority and power. I mean, again, in criminal justice, particularly, many people are attracted to the field because it's automatic, a gun, a badge, authority. And so having to be an instructor in that field and there, you know, in the associated coursework, I come to this always trying to be helpful to other instructors, what personal work you have to do to be authentic if you're not part of the tradition, to give a hand and a lifeline to those who you know need it in your classes, again, who may be afraid to be themselves and to come out, and how to structure the curricular so that you can sort of weave your instructor magic to get people to, as you say, Gabi, see everybody as the people that we are rather than just an object to control. You know, many of my students, when I first get them, are very supportive of the death penalty. You know, that is the ultimate sanction that the government can impose on those who are perceived as less than and, you know, breaking the norms and committing, you know, the worst crime imaginable, such as murder. And it is a skill set that I try to develop and share. This is my point of entry to how do we engage the students by the way we talk and teach and what we present, where you're not alienating them, but actually planting the seeds of humanistic methods and approaches to get them to the other side. And again, I don't expect them to, when they leave me, abandon their belief that the death penalty is just, but my goal is to get them to see people as people, because again, in my field, the way that you can actually, the only way you can impose the death penalty, in all honesty, is to dehumanize the defendant, is to dehumanize people, to categorize them as other. So this, this decolonization of our minds, I think is one of the most important challenges that we can do as an instructor, spending the time alone. How do I talk? What do I do? What is every lecture that I deliver? How do I get everybody engaged? So even if, again, they're not changing who they are or their beliefs, they at least see things differently with an open mind. And so that's my point of entry here, is to talk about the struggle, for who we are, to get, as Marnie says, to the people we serve, our students, to help them, be better.
And Stephanie, I think sometimes what gets in the way of that are our own faculty and staff. And I'm thinking a little bit about some of the questions that have come in. I mean, many of us work in higher ed institutions that are, struck with a tremendous amount of bureaucracy and policy that is not only is it not anti-racist, but it also is problematic for the way that we want to serve our students. But with that, we have to get other faculty and staff that are either not trained in these areas or willing to explore it for themselves, to realize that so many of the processes we engage in reproduce the same problems that the institution initially had, right? Like whether it's from curricula decisions or hiring or getting folks at our institutions to believe in the importance of equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist work. So I really appreciate what you said. And I think it's, for me, even beyond our students, it's at every level of the institution.
And going back to that idea of the every level, I just want people to personally reflect on the fact that often we could have done this as, we're just going to give brief professional bios, and now we're going to tell you about a topic, and then we answer questions. And that is the colonizing format. So for those of you who are finding this unfamiliar and uncomfortable, I want you to notice the fact that for those of us who don't come from a white Anglo background, that structure that is the typical meeting, that what gets called in the literature the nice white meeting norms, that is as uncomfortable and as people unable to engage, because positionality and privilege are really important to this conversation. So, and another thing to talk about is time, norms about time. That's the unstated, elephant in the room. Had we decided how much time a conversation like this takes, is frankly, it's not just one conversation, but you can't do that in an hour. So we're sort of attempting to do this. And some of the stuff that people have asked about is to do with, okay, how do I navigate? And I think people have spoken to that already in the second pass, is how do I navigate dealing with people who are entrenched in their privilege, who want to fight for it, who are even legislatively trying to prohibit kinds of conversation they're trying to have? How do we decolonize? How do we decisnormatize? And I think one of the key issues for me is, I don't think people, sorry, I think my internet cut out again. I don't think people even realize how embedded colonizing and cisnormatizing practices we engage in, that even when you slightly change the structure of how a meeting is run, in yarning cultures, a lot of Aboriginal people often complain about the way that white Anglo meetings are run in Australia, because they're like, you know what, it didn't give them a chance to really get to the issues. And people are right that there's a longer conversation. There's a few people talking about how do you persevere when you're in a marginal place? Someone saying, I'm an Egyptian atheist, nonconformist single mother in the UK. And somebody else was talking about Hindu students finding that teachers don't respond, or this person didn't use this word, but I'm going to go ahead and say gaslighting students, talking about an anti-Hindu textbook. We've got someone again talking about that legislation. Somebody else was talking about having been, we actually do have someone who's coming to us from I think relatively far away. So not just me, there's people in other time zones. So I can't assume that there's not that. And so I think, what assumptions do we make, even when we talk about time? What time is it? Who's in what time? That I think, how long does it take to have a conversation like this? I think it takes a lot longer than we usually provide. There's someone from Lukasa, Zambia, who's here. There's people who have backgrounds in a lot of other places. what does it mean to decolonize? I think how do we acknowledge positionality and privilege and assumptions about time? And how uncomfortable is it for people when the white Anglo norms about how time is done, which are sort of imposed on us in academia, what happens when we change those? You know, people go, oh, but where's my agenda, right? And that's a fair question. That's what happens when we take away the privilege or the assumption. What happens when we don't go to the nice white meeting norms? I think it makes people very uncomfortable. And one of the challenges we face in decolonizing is how do we become aware of practices that we don't even know are colonizing? Because even those of us who aren't from those, you know, from the background of the dominant group, we absorb those or we have to buy into them. By the time you get to the point where, let's say Stephanie is, you're so embedded in that system that although you can challenge all these structural things, there's certain ones of it that you've had to buy into just to function in that system, right? So before we had talked about you have to publish, you know that publish or perish thing. What do you have to publish? Where do you have to publish? High impact journals, that sort of thing. So, and we've decided that we're actually going to stay around for another 15 minutes so that we can continue to have this conversation because it's important. But notice what happens when we make the slightest change to that colonizing meeting structure. It's a different conversation we've been having. And by the way, it's a kinder, more respectful conversation because it becomes less about fighting against each other's opinions and more about seeing each other as people. That point Stephanie was talking about humanizing people. It's part of decolonizing is about not being the faceless other. It's about becoming the person with a specific lived experience and history who makes sense, who has narratives, who has stories. And that is what you get from a yarning conversation, a spiral conversation that you will not get from a linear nice white meeting conversation where all of the terms are already dictated. It's the difference between coming out versus inviting in. If I come out to you about a fact, you will fit that fact into your pre-existing model of the world and nothing changes. You have the same model of the world, you just fit me into it. And that's why diversity isn't on its own enough to make changes in these areas. Whereas if someone provides their context, the way that Jenny and Stephanie and Mani have today, you've provided the context. Now we've humanized ourselves and we've now created a shared basis, a narrative basis for connection. And that is one of the ways that we effectively decolonize, because part of the colonizing system is a capitalist system that views people as commodities. And so you are just on your products. You know, how many degrees do you have? How many papers have you published? How many books have you written? Rather than who you are as a being and how you approach your topic. So I'd like to give other people a chance, other people on the panel, an opportunity to talk about, okay, how do we, on a structural level as well as a content level, how do we, at the 4 levels of oppression, you know, the ideological, the institutional, the interpersonal, and the internal, how do we decolonize? How do we decolonize and how do we cisnormatize?
Well, my approach was to write my own textbook. And again, this is why we're here, right? Where I think we're all connected to SAGE in some way. But what I found, again, in my field is who was writing the textbook, you know, sort of like to the victor goes the spoils. So when we talk about curricula issues, I think there's a ton of resources on the internet that one can find that can be very helpful, especially if you're in a situation like I am, which is a conservative sort of rural area. And again, I know we're not all in higher ed, but where diverse, someone like me doesn't necessarily come along every day. Again, you have to be strategic. I think if there's any piece of advice, yes, the fight that we engage in is every day, ourselves and with our colleagues, and Marnie's right, and our administrators, that fight is every day. But with our students, it is kind of a slow burn. You have to know when to do it and what particular pieces you can introduce, and that you can find anywhere. That I think is the gift of the World Wide Web. What's important though, since we are struggling, no matter who you are, if you're here, you want to know more, and you're joining us in the fight and the struggle, you have to take care of yourself. So, you know, again, you have to know, can you go pedal to the metal all the time, all the time, all the time? You'll get chewed up. And so you can't do that. So, so curricular wise, you can find the resources and then spend the time how to introduce them. Personal wise, you're going to need allies. And if you can't get them where you are immediately, you know, contact any of us. I mean, I'm so happy to have met my co-panelists, because as long as you have like-minded people, they're going to sustain you. They're going to, you know, put water in the well for you. You know, you cannot do it all yourself. And if you try and be that voice, you're going to be an easier target to shut down. And you're not gonna survive and thrive. And you know, you do have to, again, if you're in higher ed, you do have to publish, you do have to do service, and you know, you got to take and you have to be a good teacher. So you know, this is a lifetime investment. That's the best way to.
And Stephanie, I think kind of going along with that, something that else is really important is wherever it is you work or whatever your academic alliances might be, find a way to do coalition building. And I know sometimes people get a little nervous about coalition building, especially if you work in the United States and states with unions or non-unions. It's a whole nother discussion for another day. But finding who works in the system and who works outside of the system that you yourself can work with. So if you're trying to create, you know, an anti-racist curriculum, or trying to work with your larger school's curriculum committee on having an anti-racist lens on curriculum that's proposed, you need someone that's in that field, right, in that kind of curricular work, that knows how to play the system, as well as somebody who's not and can bring in some of this kind of anti-racist decolonizing literature to not only get it approved, but get it in the hands of other faculty. So you are not the only one in your classes saying what needs to be said. You need colleagues to be supportive of that. And I think making sure that you've got folks not just in your discipline, but in an interdiscipline level, where you're working together. If the goal is to have students graduate with an anti-racist lens, well, what needs to happen in the curricula throughout their time at your institution? And at what entry points, using kind of what Gavi was talking about, do we need to check whether assess or evaluate is something you want to do, but kind of make sure that they're moving along the journey towards anti-racism. So by the time they're close to graduating, they understand the importance of talking about anti-racism on the job market, right? And then we're having our students use what we're teaching them, move into other places. But I think about the institution I work at, we need people in administration, we need people on committees, we need staff, we need mentors. Everybody has to be on this path, even though we come in at different journeys, with a willingness to work together and form a coalition that at the end of the day is creating a student population that is anti-racist and decolonizing and passing that message on to future generations. And I'd be happy to talk about some of that as well.
I'll jump in here if I could. I love what Stephanie said about writing the book. For similar reasons, I edited the encyclopedia. Edited Encyclopedia of Trans Studies for SAGE, because I wanted to shape the conversation. I wanted to make sure that what students are going to be reading, high school, college students, that's who reads encyclopedias typically, they're going to be reading something that was going to be intersectional, that dealt with race just as much as it did gender identity, that was going to include non-binary people, because so often the conversation on trans is just about binary trans people. And for a similar reason, I do a lot of editing and peer review, because it's a way I can insert myself into the conversation by doing peer review of academic journal articles. I can shape the conversation because I get to have a say in what gets published and how it gets published. So I can have an impact there, because I don't want to do all the gazillion studies, but I could have an impact by seeing how other people conduct their studies and calling them when they're doing studies that are horribly uninclusive. You know, it's like, there's no reason we need to be having studies published today that are a whole bunch of white people. And then they say in the limitations, oh, we had almost all white people. Someone else should do a study that includes BIPOC people. No, you should have effing done a study that included BIPOC people. We're not going to publish this because there's no reason you didn't do this better. So that's where I try to assert myself. I want to make just 4 really quick points about classroom practices and trying to de-cis the classroom. I think it's just so important to create an environment that people can be known by the name and the pronouns they want to go by, and to have that respected so that there's a clear policy that we're going to respect names and pronouns of folks and that misgendering does get called. Also, avoiding a gender binary in class readings and class examples. So in stats classes, not having probability men versus women, or having a textbook that in psychology that breaks down studies, men do this, women do that. And if you're forced to use a textbook like that, point it out, name it, and have readings that address trans people and what their experiences are like. Because I think so often we only relegate trans people to sort of like one day or 1 week. It's sort of what I call the academic version of the Trans Day of Remembrance. We do trans once a year, or now with the Trans Day of Visibility, which is today, we do it twice a year. And that's obviously not enough. We need to be doing trans throughout the curriculum in humanities, social science courses, and need to also not require trans people to have to speak for trans people. You need to educate yourself about the experience of trans people and be able to include that and make sure it's a fully inclusive curriculum, not just token trans inclusion, which I so often see.
I think that's a really good point. What Jen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
No, I was just going to say I want Jenny to be my new friend. I want to. That energy and power.
I think one of I think one of the challenges too is when I find trans issues being talked about or trans people's existence being acknowledged in academia, it's usually like Jenny was saying, it's a siloed conversation, right? It's, oh, we're talking about this group of people, but now let's go talk about the regular topics. And in the regular topics, it's like you don't exist. You're just totally erased. And classroom practices that kind of highlight this, when I'm talking about a topic, I'll usually just throw in a mention of, people of trans experience, women and men of trans experience. I'll talk about non-binary people. I'll talk about gender diversity across cultural spectra. And what's interesting is that most of the academic mentions of the existence of trans people, non-binary people, it's always a very white Anglo lens too. So there's no, I can remember so many times hearing lecturers or reading academic assigned papers where they describe things as, well, there's the 2 traditional genders, but now we have such and such. And it's like, but who's we? Whose societies are being excluded? And I think that's a key issue to think about is what are decolonizing practices? Someone had mentioned curriculum. One of the things I do in my curricula is I always include assignments that are not only peer-reviewed papers, but I include brief video clips and brief writings by people with lived experience, as well as the intersection between people who are scholars who also have lived experience, people who have a kind of, and I always ask people to doing assigned paper, like someone was saying, you have to actually acknowledge the positionality of the authors. If they haven't told you their positionality, what are they assuming? What kind of privileges do the authors assume? When they say we, who is this we? I can remember a class that I took where there was an attempt at a welcome to students, and it wasn't a welcome to country, it was a welcome to students. And in this, the lecturer was talking about clinical leadership. And the lecturer said in this video, this 5-minute video that made me withdraw from an entire program I was planning to do, 5 minutes I was out because this person said, well, we in Australia have a high life expectancy. We in Australia, and I raised this issue and said, actually Aboriginal people don't have a high life expectancy. When you said we, that was including only some people in Australia. And could you make a correction to this video? And I was told, no, it's not a problem. They've already covered Aboriginal people in their last unit. And I thought, I'm out. This is colonizing. So sometimes you can play the game. Sometimes you can challenge the cisnormatizing, and you can challenge cisgenderist practices. You can challenge colonizing, and sometimes you can't. And in that moment, it took me 5 minutes to figure out that there was no way for me to challenge that. Whereas in other cases, like my teaching in Poland, Poland has a very conservative environment right now. I mean, there's actual stickers being promoted that say LGBT free zone. And so what I do with students is I constantly talk about those issues and concerns, because I know that it's the faculty based in Poland don't have the same privilege I do of being free to, because I'm teaching by distance now. I'm not physically there. So I can criticize the government. I can say things I need to say. Whereas if I was based there, embedded in the institution, I couldn't say that. So part of it is if you're embedded in the institution, like Stephanie said, there's a wonderful book by Dr. Lindo Bacon called Radical Belonging. And this book really talks about this issue of how much we need belonging and connectedness, and that we need to find our people, because you need that mirror held up. So part of, and people have said, you know, why haven't we made this a conversation open with everyone and showing everyone's video? That's the challenge of a large format. So by choosing to include more people, like 200 and something people, what we've done is we've actually made it difficult to have that be more collaborative. So even that choice structurally is one that we acknowledge there were pros and cons to. More people able to attend, but fewer people able to interact. And even just the chat, for those of you who don't see it because you're not panelists, just to let the attendees know, there are dozens of things. Like I couldn't even respond to all of them. We've been reading them periodically, but there's so many of them. When you have 200 people and you've got 40 different open questions and you've got a initially 1 hour format, it really does limit our ability. And that's what I've tried to highlight today is it's not just the content. It's not just your curricular content. It's what type of power dynamic do you set up with students? How culturally safe is your classroom? What type of format do you structure your class in? And who does that privilege and who does that challenge? And just really thinking about that, what we've tried to do is model the types of conversations that are different from colonizing conversations, from cisnormalizing conversations, but at the same time, we can't do that all in an hour. So looking at structurally, what are the limitations and how do we offset that? I think that's what we've tried to do. But as some of the comments reflect, there's no way to do that because this structure itself would need to be broadened. And I think that is a key message that I've heard embedded in what other people have said, although not necessarily as explicitly as I've just said it. Time itself is a cultural norm. The way we approach time and structure and managing meetings. And if you're not looking at that stuff, like how does stuff, work in the classroom? People who are autistic are not often wanting to respond live in the moment, but rather would like to prepare. So some classes will prepare transcripts of the entire thing in advance. For other people like me, we would have trouble giving you that transcript. So how do we bridge those divides? How do we act like engineers who come up with, who are given 10 sets of specs that all contrast with each other? And how do we make sure that those competing specs are not just whose specs do we privilege, but a question of how. How do we include all these specs and design a building? Because that's what engineers do all the time. They have competing stakeholders and demands and they do it. We need to think like engineers as well. I'm gonna let other people speak because I know we're at time.
I wanted to just address, I did see in the chat, someone asked, they were in the UK, how to talk about decolonization and make it a comfortable conversation. And these conversations rarely are comfortable, but you can establish a structure, much like Gavi is saying in terms of engineering, where one suggestion is to have somebody, when you're having a conversation about anything, and this is just to prep before you get to a difficult topic such as colonization, is you take an object, and if you're in a group and you're all talking about an issue, you hand an object, you pass it around like musical chairs, and whoever has the object then has to give The contrarian point of view has to play, for lack of a better word, the devil's advocate, no matter who it is. And it can't always be the same person. And you just pass it around and pass it around. And this is one way to encourage diversity of thought and what they call psychological safety, that people will feel free to speak out, because you're training people who may not believe in what they're saying, but it's their job when they're holding the object to go against the groupthink. So the conversations might not be comfortable, but if you practice this before you get to those difficult conversations, you might have more meaningful conversations where people won't be afraid to speak.
Stephanie, in the sake for time, and I now, Gavi, all I can think about is how colonizing time can be. And I think we see that in so many practices, particularly throughout North America. I'm thinking about the institution of medicine, and everything is on a time schedule based on the colonized understanding of medicine. Women's birth is a great example, but I know this is not the time to get into that. But I'm thinking about with my students, when I set up, when the class, well, I would like to say that all my classes have an anti-racist lens to them, but if it's a topic that I think is going to be unfamiliar to students, we start the semester by creating agreements that everybody is held to every class. We sign them, we discuss them, we spend 2 weeks debating them. What is going to make this class psychologically safety for these topics that we're going to discuss? And it usually gives students that feel nervous, which oftentimes are my white students, my white cisgender heterosexual students, they're often a little nervous about these conversations. And by saying, it's not that there isn't a wrong question, but how we ask our question, our intent to do no harm, but our intent to learn is what should be shaping how we do things. And I think when you set the tone that this class is about like holistic learning and about trying to make ourselves better, and then the paths that we choose for our careers to be better in those fields, it helps students also realize that the classroom doesn't have to be colonized. It can be a shared space where you, the prof, and the students are working together to learn something. But I think a lot of us in academia have been feared to do that because of the power structures and the hierarchy at play. I find students respond very well to that if they're a part of the process versus it being handed to them and saying, let's create together what we want this class to be. And when we create these agreements or these arrangements and we hold ourselves to them throughout the semester.
And so I think this is the start of a much longer conversation, set of conversations. I think things to think about is, look at this format. Decide something with 200 people, or would you try to do 3 or 4 different things with a smaller group of people so everyone's face could be visible, which we all did talk about, and it just isn't practically possible. Is think about what we allow with the format or not. Think about how do we have conversations with students? How do we have conversations with our peers? Do we talk differently with our peers than we do with students? And if so, what's the power dynamic with that? And what are the built-in norms that we're coming into? So what the environment that we're already coming into, what are the assumptions, and which assumptions do we need to challenge? And as Stephanie said, that will very much depend on who you have around you, how far advanced you are in the hierarchy, and what committees you're on, who you have influence with. And so I think thinking about all of these things, it's quite complex. So if anyone wants to be in touch with any of us, people will include that. Curtis, although Curtis wasn't a panelist, there's a lot of valuable things that Curtis has to say. Certainly, I'm looking forward to reading Curtis's book. So if anyone wants to get in touch with any of us, Olivia will provide information. I want to thank everyone. And I also want to say, part of why we're not going to say, here's the right answer, just do these things, is because that's a cultural competence framework. What we were trying to do today was not to give you all the answers, it's to let you know that you need to be asking the questions. And there's probably questions that all of us need to be asking that we didn't yet know we needed to ask. And so if we've given you something to think about, if you're asking questions, whether it's because the structure we've had with the sort of colonizing approach to time and to how we're structuring Zoom, if that has troubled you, I want you to think about what that means to inform you. And also I wonder if you found this meeting agenda and structure alienating, think about how much that means about nice white meeting norms. And again, there are those readings and those links. How uncomfortable is that? But what kind of conversation, how has today's conversation been different for you? What was your experience? How is it different from when you have those nice white meeting norms and you have that linear structure? If we had had another hour or two, we probably could have delved into some of the content you wanted, but I think there's so much missing when we do that linear structure, because what we're modeling for you here today is we're owning our positionality and our privilege. And a lot of times people haven't. So again, people are starting to ask questions. Someone said, what about the phrase my students? Exactly. We need to ask those questions. The word client, I don't use the word client as a therapist. I say participants, people coming to me. That's it. What does that mean when I say someone's a participant, someone participates in therapy with me? What does it mean to say this person is a student in my class versus it, or is it my class? Is it our class? Here is a student in our class, right? So even these assumptions, you can go to Paulo Freire, talked a lot about pedagogy of the oppressed. It's a good place to start if you want to start to understand the fundamental ideas behind decolonizing education. And I think that there's a lot of points of entry, but I think we can help you with resources, but this is ultimately work that you're going to have to do. So rather than us give you the answers, what we wanted to do today was just raise questions that will require a lot of further work. And so if we want to decisnormatize, we want to challenge the norms. How often do people use binary gendered language in classrooms? When I start to say she, they, or he, students perk up. Oh, Gavi's just used a they as a singular pronoun, talking about people. And I'll reference that when I talk about non-binary scholars intentionally. So that's one way to do it. But again, that doesn't give you enough, right? That's just the start. So think about where each of you is at right now and think about what would my personal next 2 or 3 steps be? How would I start to decolonize? What is my attitude to them? What are those nice white meeting norms, like the right to comfort when people talk about people getting uncomfortable? So I'm going to close out because I know that people have to leave soon, but I want you to notice that these conversations, and Aboriginal people have this complaint all the time in Australia, these conversations take more time than the white Anglo meeting structure allows. So we started the conversation, this is not the end, and I hope that people will connect with us. I hope to connect with the other panelists again, and so we can continue these conversations because they are very important. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Curtis. Thank you to Rihanna. Thank you to Olivia. Thank you to Dr. Dave. Thank you to Michael, Jenny, Mani, Stephanie. It's really important to have these conversations. Again, this is the start.